Welcome to Fact Nexus, where we uncover the mind-blowing truths that history textbooks never taught you. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into 11 shocking historical facts that will completely change how you understand the past. From ancient empires to medieval kingdoms, from famous leaders to lost civilizations, we're about to reveal some of the most incredible secrets hidden in history. If you're ready to have your mind blown, stick with us till the end. And don't forget to subscribe for daily mind-bending facts that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Let's begin. When we think about the Great Wall of China, most of us imagine massive fortifications built to keep invading armies from pouring into the empire. It's the image that's been burned into our minds by movies and history books for centuries. But here's what might surprise you. That's actually not why it was built at all. The Great Wall was primarily constructed as an enormous customs checkpoint, designed not to keep enemies out, but to control trade and collect taxes from merchants traveling along the legendary Silk Road. Think about it from the perspective of ancient China's rulers. They had a massive empire with incredible goods, silk, porcelain, tea, that people from all over the world wanted to buy. Why would they build a wall to stop trade when they could use that same wall to regulate it and get rich in the process? The large fortresses you see dotted along the wall weren't military strongholds designed for epic battles. They were essentially ancient border control stations where officials would inspect goods, levy taxes, and keep meticulous records of everything passing through. And here's the fascinating part. Much of the wall was poorly maintained and had deliberate gaps in it. Invading armies, when they did come, often simply negotiated with the guards or went around these weak points altogether.
The wall was like a toll booth more than a fortress, and the revenue it generated actually funded much of its own construction and maintenance. So next time someone tells you about the Great Wall's military prowess, you'll know the real story. It was built for profit, not protection. Here's one of history's greatest misconceptions, and it's largely thanks to some very clever propaganda. We've all heard about Napoleon's inferiority complex, the theory that his aggressive military campaigns were driven by anger over his diminutive stature. Popular culture has convinced us that the man was practically a dwarf, leading to what psychologists even call the Napoleon complex. But the truth is far more interesting, and frankly, quite embarrassing for the British. Napoleon wasn't short at all. He was actually quite average height for a man of his time. Historians estimate he stood around 5 feet 7 inches tall, which in the late 1700s and early 1800s was completely normal, perhaps even slightly above average. So why did the myth persist? The answer is simple: propaganda. The British, who were his enemies and desperately wanted to make him look ridiculous, spread rumors and exaggerated claims about his physical stature. It was an early example of what we'd now call a misinformation campaign. They even nicknamed him Le Petit Caporal, which translates to the Little Corporal. But this was actually an affectionate nickname used by his own soldiers, not an insult about his height. But the British seized on it and ran with it, turning it into a tool of mockery. What makes this even more interesting is that measurements from different countries didn't always align. A French inch was actually different from a British inch. So when they compared measurements, the numbers seemed to confirm what they were already claiming. Napoleon's actual height wasn't the problem. The problem was that he was brilliant, charismatic, and terrifyingly effective as a military strategist. The British needed to diminish him somehow, and if they couldn't do it on the battlefield, they'd do it through ridiculing his appearance. It's a fascinating reminder that even historical narratives we take as absolute fact are sometimes just the lies that stuck around long enough to become accepted truth.
Imagine being on your deathbed, knowing that your final words might be recorded for history. You'd probably want to say something profound, something that captures the essence of your life and legacy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of the most famous last words attributed to historical figures were never actually spoken. They were invented, imagined, or simply misremembered by people who weren't even in the room when the person died. Let's take Oscar Wilde, the brilliant Irish writer and playwright. His famous last words are recorded as something along the lines of, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has to go." It's witty, it's memorable, it's perfectly in character, and historians genuinely don't know if he ever said it. The only person who was supposedly there when he made this comment was someone writing about it years later, with no corroboration whatsoever. Or consider the last words of Joan of Arc, one of the most famous figures in medieval history. She's often quoted as having said powerful things about her faith and her mission, but in reality, the accounts are contradictory and muddled. The people writing about her death had their own agendas and biases, and the truth of what she actually said is lost to history. This pattern repeats itself again and again. Historians have actually discovered that they, consciously or unconsciously, tend to add better last words to the stories of important people. It's almost like we feel that a person's life needs to be neatly wrapped up with a perfect conclusion, like the final sentence of a well-written book. But real life isn't like that. Most people's deaths are messy, confusing, and undignified. So instead of accepting that uncomfortable reality, we've collectively rewritten history to include poetic justice and profound wisdom. The fascinating irony is that this practice highlights something important about how we understand history itself. We don't just record the past, we interpret it, refine it, and often remake it into something more palatable to our sensibilities. If you could somehow travel back in time to ancient Egypt and walk through the bustling streets of Alexandria or Memphis, you might be shocked by what you'd see. The beauty standards that governed Egyptian society were radically different from what we consider beautiful today, and some of them might strike you as genuinely bizarre. Let's start with eyebrows. In modern times, having full, natural eyebrows is considered attractive. In ancient Egypt, it was practically the opposite. People, both men and women, would completely pluck out their eyebrows and keep them permanently removed. It wasn't vanity gone wrong. It was actually deeply practical and symbolic. Egyptian women would use early forms of wax or had their eyebrows professionally removed. The practice served multiple purposes. It helped protect the delicate skin around the eyes from the intense Egyptian sun, and it carried symbolic meaning related to mourning and religious devotion. But that was just the beginning of their beauty regimen. Both men and women wore elaborate makeup, which might surprise people who think of cosmetics as a primarily feminine concern. They would paint their eyes with kohl, a black pigment made from minerals like galena. They used green eyeshadow made from powdered malachite. And, importantly, they saw nothing strange about men doing this. In fact, a man without makeup might be seen as unkempt or low status. The Egyptians also had very different standards about body shape. While modern Western culture often idealizes thinness, ancient Egyptians celebrated fuller figures, particularly in women. A rounder body was seen as a sign of fertility, health, and prosperity. If you had money and access to good food, you could afford to be fuller, and that was beautiful. Another shocking standard: baldness. Both men and women would shave their heads completely or wear elaborate wigs. The shaved head was considered not just acceptable, but actually desirable, symbolizing cleanliness and status.
Wealthy individuals would wear intricately braided wigs made from human hair or plant fibers. These weren't emergency solutions for hair loss. They were fashionable accessories that signified wealth and importance. And let's not forget about the lip color. Ancient Egyptians used henna to stain their lips and nails a reddish-brown color, creating a look that was meant to be both seductive and powerful. When you put all of this together, you realize that beauty standards aren't universal truths. They're culturally constructed ideas that change dramatically over time and geography. What seems beautiful in one era seems bizarre in another. One of the greatest unsolved mysteries of history is why the mighty Roman Empire eventually collapsed. Historians have proposed countless theories: barbarian invasions, economic collapse, the rise of Christianity, overexpansion, disease, and civil unrest. But there's one theory that's increasingly gaining credence among modern scientists and historians: lead poisoning. It sounds almost too simple to be true, but consider this. The ancient Romans were incredibly advanced in many ways, including their engineering. They built aqueducts, massive structures designed to transport water from distant sources into cities. It was a remarkable feat of engineering, and a major reason why Roman cities were so successful and hygienic compared to other places in the world. But here's the critical problem. The Romans used lead pipes to construct much of their water delivery systems. Lead, as we now know very well, is highly toxic. When water runs through lead pipes, it dissolves some of the lead, and that contaminated water then flows directly into the homes and public fountains of the city. And the Romans didn't just drink water with lead in it. They also added lead compounds to their wine, believing it created a sweet flavor. They used lead-based cosmetics. Lead compounds were used in food preservation. Elite Romans, particularly those in positions of power, were exposed to lead constantly through multiple sources. The effects of chronic lead exposure are particularly damaging to the brain. It causes mental dysfunction, behavioral problems, aggression, inability to concentrate, and, in severe cases, paralysis. Some historians theorize that as the concentration of lead in the water supply increased, particularly in Rome itself, the cognitive abilities of the ruling class deteriorated. Imagine emperors and senators becoming increasingly irrational, paranoid, and incapable of sound judgment due to lead poisoning. It could have contributed to increasingly erratic political decisions, poor military strategies, and the kind of internal conflict that weakened the empire from within. Of course, lead poisoning alone didn't bring down Rome. The empire faced multiple simultaneous crises, and the barbarian invasions were certainly a major factor. But it's entirely possible that lead poisoning lowered the empire's ability to respond effectively to those crises. It's a humbling thought. One of history's greatest civilizations might have been undone not by enemies or ideology, but by their own sophisticated water system slowly poisoning them. When we think about the medieval period, we often imagine chaos, darkness, and superstition. But what might surprise you is that medieval societies were actually quite legalistic.
They had detailed laws, written codes, and enforcement mechanisms.
The problem is, those laws were sometimes absolutely bonkers by modern standards. Let's talk about sumptuary laws, laws that regulated what people could wear based on their social status. In medieval England, these laws were incredibly specific and strictly enforced. If you were a merchant, you couldn't wear certain fabrics. If you were not of noble birth, you couldn't wear purple. Only royalty could wear the color purple, and violation of this law could result in severe punishment, up to and including execution. It sounds absurd to us now, but in that era, clothing was one of the primary ways that social hierarchy was communicated. A peasant wearing noble clothing wasn't just committing a fashion faux pas, they were challenging the entire social order. The nobility took this extremely seriously. There were also laws about what colors different professions could wear, laws about the length of clothing, laws about how many buttons you could have on your coat. Violating a sumptuary law could result in fines, public humiliation, or worse. And here's where it gets really strange. There were laws against whistling. In some medieval towns, whistling on a Sunday was illegal. Why? Well, the reasoning is a bit murky, but many theories suggest it was because whistling was associated with frivolity or pagan practices, and the Sabbath was meant to be a solemn religious day. Another bizarre medieval law. Women couldn't wear buttons. Buttons were considered dangerously seductive because they drew attention to a woman's figure. Yes, you read that right. Buttons were so sexually provocative that they were banned. The reasoning was that if buttons drew a man's eye to a woman's body, it could lead to lustful thoughts, which was a sin. So buttons became symbols of moral corruption. There were laws about marriage, laws about commerce, laws about religious observance, and many of them contained punishments that make modern legal systems look positively reasonable. A baker who sold underweight bread might have it publicly displayed while he was whipped. A merchant who cheated customers might be pilloried. These weren't just legal consequences. They were designed to be humiliating, painful, and public, to serve as warnings to others. When most people think of Cleopatra, they imagine an exotic Egyptian beauty with dark skin, dressed in flowing linen, speaking in a mysterious accent. Popular culture has created this image of Cleopatra as the quintessential Egyptian queen. But the historical reality is far different, and it's actually a pretty interesting story about how Hollywood has rewritten history. Cleopatra VII, the most famous Cleopatra, was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were actually Macedonian Greeks who took over Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquests. When Alexander died and his empire was divided among his generals, one of those generals, Ptolemy, took Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 300 years. So Cleopatra, despite ruling Egypt, was fundamentally Greek, not Egyptian. She had Greek ancestry, Greek culture, and a Greek education. In fact, she was probably quite pale by modern beauty standards, with Mediterranean features typical of Greek or Macedonian heritage. Now, you might wonder how we know what she looked like. Well, ancient coins that bear her image show a woman with a quite prominent nose, not the delicate, beautiful face that Hollywood actresses have portrayed. Ancient coins are great historical records because they show rulers as they actually were, not as they wanted to be remembered. Cleopatra was not a woman whose primary power came from her beauty. That's a narrative that Hollywood invented. Her real power came from her mind. She was extraordinarily intelligent and educated. She spoke between 8 and 9 languages, which was rare even for educated people of her era. She studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and science. She was a brilliant diplomat and strategist. She understood the complexities of governing a kingdom caught between the rising power of Rome and the declining power of the Hellenistic world. Her relationship with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony was strategic as much as it was romantic. She was trying to preserve Egypt's independence during a time when Rome was swallowing up everything around it. So when we look at Cleopatra as a historical figure rather than a legend, we see a woman who was primarily powerful because of her intelligence, education, and political acumen, not because she was beautiful. The irony is that Hollywood, in trying to make her story more dramatic and romantic, has actually diminished her real accomplishments and replaced them with a fantasy of seduction.
The real Cleopatra is far more interesting than the myth. One of the most famous stories in history is the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. It's often presented as a single catastrophic event, a terrible day when humanity's greatest repository of knowledge went up in flames, lost forever. Some versions of the story blame religious zealots, others blame invaders, and some blame specific historical figures. But the truth is far more complex and, in some ways, more tragic. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed in a single day. It was destroyed gradually, over centuries, by multiple different events and people. The first major damage came during the civil war of Julius Caesar around 48 BCE. Caesar's forces were fighting in Alexandria, and a fire broke out that damaged parts of the library and surrounding buildings. But this wasn't a deliberate targeting of the library. It was collateral damage in a military conflict. The library survived this initial blow, but it had been damaged.
Then, over the following centuries, there were additional fires, earthquakes, and incidents of damage. Different invaders and rulers damaged it at different times. By the time of late antiquity, when Christianity was becoming the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, the library was a shadow of its former self. In 391 CE, the temple complex that housed the library was damaged during religious conflicts, and the remaining collections suffered significant losses. So we're not talking about a single dramatic moment where all of humanity's knowledge was lost. We're talking about a slow decline over 4.5 centuries with multiple contributing factors. This actually makes the story more poignant in some ways. It suggests that the loss of knowledge at Alexandria wasn't due to a single villain we can blame, but rather a combination of human negligence, warfare, natural disasters, and religious conflict. And it's not even true that everything was lost. Many texts from the library had been copied and existed in other places. Scholars from the library had shared their knowledge with other institutions. So, while the physical library was destroyed, some of the intellectual content it contained survived through these copies and through the memories and writings of scholars. The tragedy of Alexandria is not that all knowledge was suddenly lost, but that much of it was. It reminds us that the preservation of human knowledge is fragile and requires constant effort and protection. When we think about Vikings, we think about fierce barbarians, raiding parties coming out of nowhere to pillage and destroy. We imagine brutality, chaos, and savagery. Images of horned helmets, bloodthirsty warriors, and destroyed villages dominate our historical imagination. But the reality of Viking society was far more complex and, frankly, far more civilized than popular culture would have us believe. First, let's address the obvious. Yes, Vikings did raid and plunder. But here's what's important to understand. Most Vikings weren't raiders. Scholars estimate that the vast majority, probably around 90% of Vikings, were farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and traders. The raiders get all the attention in history books because they were dramatic and violent, but they represent a tiny fraction of Viking society. The Vikings, particularly those living in Scandinavia, developed sophisticated trading networks that extended all the way to Baghdad, Constantinople, and beyond. They weren't just taking what they wanted, they were actively engaged in commerce. Archaeologists have found evidence of extensive trade routes where Vikings exchanged furs, amber, tin, and other goods for silk, spices, and luxuries from the Middle East and beyond. Viking society also had a surprisingly advanced legal system. They had councils called things, where disputes were settled, laws were made, and justice was administered. These weren't primitive courts. They had established procedures and codes of conduct. Decisions made at these gatherings were binding and enforced. Another surprising aspect of Viking culture Women had significantly more rights than women in most contemporary European societies. Viking women could own property, initiate divorce, operate businesses, and in some cases, even fight in battle or lead expeditions. If a husband was absent, his wife managed the household and made important decisions. This was radical compared to medieval European societies, where women had almost no legal rights. Vikings also had a writing system, runic alphabets, and they left written records. They weren't a purely oral culture. They carved their language into stone, wood, and bone. They had poets called skalds, who composed complex poetry about their achievements, and this poetry was often written down. Vikings also developed highly sophisticated crafts. Their jewelry, weapons, and shipbuilding techniques were remarkably advanced. The construction of Viking ships, the longships, required incredible engineering knowledge and skilled labor. These weren't crude boats made by primitive peoples. They were marvels of design that allowed Vikings to navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers. So when we look at Vikings holistically, we see a civilization with complex social structures, advanced commerce, established legal systems, skilled crafts, and surprisingly progressive gender relations, all of which complicates our image of them as simple barbarians. Yes, they were warriors, and yes, they conducted raids, but they were also farmers, merchants, engineers, poets, and legislators. Today, the Olympic Games are one of the world's most prestigious sporting events. Athletes train for years, nations compete for medals, and billions of people watch from home. But the ancient Olympics, from which our modern games draw inspiration, were something completely different. They were primarily religious ceremonies, and the athletes performed entirely naked. Yes, you read that right, completely nude. The ancient Olympics were held every 4 years in Olympia, Greece, as a festival dedicated to the god Zeus. The sporting competitions were secondary to the religious rituals. The event would begin with massive religious processions, sacrifices to Zeus, and elaborate ceremonies designed to honor the god. The athletic competitions were part of this religious observance, not the main event. Athletes would strip completely naked and cover themselves with olive oil. Then they would rub sand all over their oiled bodies. This wasn't done for comfort. In fact, it was quite uncomfortable. The practice served multiple purposes. It displayed the athletes' bodies to the gods and to the spectators. It helped prevent overheating during competition, and it made the athletes harder to grab during wrestling events. The nudity itself was considered beautiful and appropriate for honoring the gods.
The Greeks had no shame about the human body in this context. Male nudity in athletic competition was seen as a celebration of physical perfection offered up to the divine. Women, on the other hand, were absolutely forbidden from watching the games. In fact, if a woman was caught sneaking into the stadium to watch, the penalty was death. She would be thrown off a cliff. This wasn't hyperbole or legend, it was written law. So while the male athletes were celebrated for their naked bodies, women were excluded entirely from witnessing the spectacle. The winners of Olympic competitions didn't receive gold, silver, and bronze medals like modern athletes. Instead, they received a wreath made of olive leaves from the sacred olive tree at Olympia. But the real reward was fame and status. Olympic victors became celebrities in their home cities. Statues were erected in their honor. They were granted pensions and special privileges for life. In some cases, they were treated almost like gods themselves. Being an Olympic victor was one of the greatest honors a person could achieve in the ancient world. The Olympic Games continued for nearly 1,200 years, making them one of the longest-running sporting traditions in human history. But they were suspended in 393 CE when the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, a Christian, banned pagan festivals. The Games wouldn't be revived until the modern Olympics began in 1896. When we talk about ancient predictions that came true, we often assume there was something magical or mystical about them. We imagine seers gazing into crystal balls or priests interpreting divine omens. But the truth is far more interesting and rational. Ancient civilizations could make surprisingly accurate predictions about the future, not through magic, but through mathematics, careful observation, and understanding of patterns. Let's start with the Maya civilization. The Maya were extraordinary mathematicians and astronomers. They developed a calendar system of mind-bending complexity and accuracy. They calculated the length of the year to be 365.2420 days. The modern scientific measurement is 365.2422 days. That's an accuracy of about 20 decimal places. How did they achieve this level of precision without telescopes or computers? Through careful observation over centuries. They watched the stars, recorded their movements, and through mathematical analysis, figured out the exact length of Earth's year. With that knowledge, they could predict when celestial events would occur decades, centuries, or even thousands of years in advance. The ancient Greeks had their own predictive achievements. Aristarchus of Samos, a Greek philosopher and mathematician, proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, the idea that the sun, not the Earth, was at the center, nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus. He wasn't claiming to be a mystic. He was using mathematics and logical observation to figure out how the universe actually worked. Archimedes, another ancient mathematician and engineer, described the principles of pulleys, levers, and other machines that would be used for thousands of years. His predictions about how mechanical systems would work came true because he understood the mathematical laws governing them. In ancient India, mathematicians discovered the concept of zero and invented the positional number system that we still use today. This wasn't mystical prophecy. It was intellectual innovation that allowed for more advanced calculations than any other system available at the time. Ancient astrology, which we often dismiss as superstition, was actually rooted in careful observation and pattern recognition. Ancient peoples noticed that certain celestial events seemed to correlate with earthly events. They tracked these patterns across generations and created systems for predicting future events based on previous correlations. Were these predictions always accurate? No, but they were based on actual observation and mathematical analysis, not magic. The real lesson here is that ancient people weren't less intelligent than us. They just had different tools and different knowledge. Given the same commitment to observation and mathematical analysis that the ancients had, they could achieve remarkable accuracy in understanding how the world worked and predicting how it would behave in the future. Their predictions came true not because they were magical, but because they were smart. And there you have it, 11 historical facts that completely change how we understand our past. From the true purpose of the Great Wall to the surprising intelligence of the Vikings, from the lead pipes that may have destroyed Rome to the mathematical genius of ancient civilizations, history is far more complex and fascinating than the simplified stories we're usually told. The great thing about learning real history is that it's often stranger and more interesting than the myths and legends that have grown up around it. If you found these facts as fascinating as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe to Fact Nexus. We upload brand new, mind-blowing facts every single day at 6 p.m. UTC, and you won't want to miss them.
Which of these facts surprised you the most? I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment below and let me know which historical myth you've now realized wasn't true. And if you have friends who love history, or who think they know everything about the ancient world, share this video with them. Challenge their assumptions and get them thinking about history in new ways. Thanks so much for watching Fact Nexus. We'll see you tomorrow with 11 more incredible facts that will blow your mind. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.